what exactly, when you say the future of America first, I think this is sort of the question you're asking, is what that means. Because what America first to me has always been, at least MAGA, what that's really been, is more of an anti-left impulse than a cohesive political program. It's always been a bit of an empty vessel that's being, that requires somebody to fill it. And when Trump was president, he filled it with his policy. But can you have a movement that is a vessel kind of waiting to be filled? What do you make of America First?
So I'll give you my perspective on this, and even in sort of titling the book "Truths." I want to speak hard truths in all directions here. So I think America First, this modern wave of it. I mean, the expressions existed for a long time, right? Dating back, Reagan used it. It's existed for a long time. But the modern version of it, I think, is a rejection of blithe neoliberalism, which I share in common in rejecting a lot of the failures of blithe neoliberalism as it relates to both the intersection of foreign policy and economic policy, and also immigration policy in the United States. That's the heart of it. And that's actually what propelled Donald Trump in 2016. This idea that somehow we were going to export Big Macs and Happy Meals and spread democracy to places like China. The idea of democratic capitalism, that we could use capitalism as a vector to spread democracy abroad. It just didn't work empirically, actually. And even worse than not working, it actually, in some ways, set us further back by increasing our dependence on adversaries like China for our own military industrial base. It doesn't make any sense that the number one country we rely on for supplies for our Air Force, Navy, Army is actually China. 40% of the semiconductors powering our military equipment come from China. It's unsustainable, doesn't make any sense. And you think they're going to keep supplying that, God forbid, in a scenario of conflict. Of course, they're not. It also allowed China, I'm going to stick to China because I think this is one of the single greatest areas where the neoliberal mythology failed, is it legitimized China morally with respect to the United States on the global stage when you actually had a lot of companies. I mean, you could pick your favorite ones, right? BlackRock, you could think about JP Morgan Chase, you could go straight down the list, the NBA, LeBron James, whoever it is, spouting off about injustices in the United States without saying a peep about actual human rights atrocities in China. And that created sort of a false moral equivalence in the global political landscape. How did they do it? They said, look, if you're a company, you can't enter the Chinese market if you're criticizing the CCP. But if you're actually criticizing or undercutting the United States, we'll roll out the red carpet. Not just through verbal criticism, but even through emissions caps. Right? If you're BlackRock, you apply Scope 3 emissions caps to Chevron in your voting power as a shareholder. You don't do the same thing even though you're a shareholder of PetroChina. So that creates a sort of economic and moral equivalence between the United States and China. And by the way, even a military dependence, that we're more dependent on China for our military than China is on us for theirs. So it created a great equalizing effect that otherwise wouldn't have played out. The idea that China would be at near parity with the United States, geopolitically, militarily, economically, in the year 2024 would have been unthinkable in the early 1990s, and yet that's exactly where the blithe neoliberalism of yesterday got us. And so you could say that at the intersection of economic policy and foreign policy. And then on immigration policy, I think we've seen a great erosion of our national identity in the United States through, among other things, the abandonment of the rule of law. You see the crisis at the southern border. I think intentional policies of beginning mass illegal migration, in part as a long-run electoral strategy for Democrats. And that's not some sort of grand conspiracy theory. It's what Democrats were saying in 2012, 2013, when they were strategically printing this in Politico magazine. There's a great article that lays this out from 2012 or so. That exactly was part of the plan, and it's worked exactly as planned. So I think what you see in the rise of MAGA and America First, and certainly the 2016 version of it, was an understandable and I think useful reactionary response to rejecting that vision. But the question of what is the alternative vision, there we have a fork in the road. And I think that that fork in the road exists right now in the America First movement today. It's percolating under the surface, right? It hasn't boiled over yet. And I touch on this right up from the outset of the introduction. Even the prologue and the introduction to my book get right into this. I think that there's two competing visions for what that future America First vision is. Both of them share a rejection of the neoliberalism of yesterday, but they have very different policy prescriptions for the future on trade, on immigration, on immigration in particular. On foreign policy, I think there could be a little bit more of an overlap when we get to that. But I think particularly trade and immigration, I think, are the areas where there's a real fork in the road coming up, and economic policy more generally. So on one wing of this, it's that, okay, we want to produce everything in the United States. Screw trade. We're done with trade. if you double click on that's what I would call maybe the national protectionist view, that American manufacturers are suffering because foreign manufacturers, not just from China, but from other countries, are dumping their products in the United States, which are driving prices down, which leave American manufacturers holding the bag. Well, you know what? We don't want those other countries selling in the United States. American manufacturers can get a decent price for their goods. I think there are a number of issues with that. There's classical economic arguments that suggest that consumers actually end up bearing the cost of that. Of course, if there's less competition, there's higher prices for goods for American workers. The very American workers, which I'll get to, we want to protect with immigration policy, supposedly, are the ones that we cause to leave holding the bag when they have to pay more for their way of life. It's inflationary. But that's a classical argument. But I think the more interesting argument at the frontier of the debate with the neoliberals of yesterday is that if we're really serious about reducing our economic dependence on China, right? Like if we're actually serious, and I actually am, on areas like the pharmaceutical supply chain or the military industrial base or the semiconductor supply chain, areas that are essential for America's long-run security and dare I say, existence, that we should not depend on our adversary for those essential areas of the American economy. Are we actually serious about declaring independence from China in those areas? I am. And I think many in the America First movement believe they are. But if yes, that actually means, I love onshoring, but it's not going to happen on a relevant time frame without also expanding relationships with Japan and South Korea and India, and you could go straight down the list. I mean, you could Vietnam, around the Pacific Rim, even beyond. That means more, not less trade with those allies. That's a hard fork in the road. So to say if you're against trade with those allies because you want a protectionist argument to protect American manufacturers from the effect of foreign competition, that's a goal you would achieve, but it comes at a trade-off, not just in the form of classical economic arguments of higher costs for consumers, and I don't disagree with some of that, but even with respect to the stated essential objective of declaring independence from China in those critical sectors. There's no free lunch. As it relates to immigration policy, I again see a fork in the road here. Depends on what our objective actually is. So I believe that we need immigration policies that understand the United States of America as more than just an economic zone. Right? The United States is not just some sort of economic landscape, okay? It's a nation with an identity. And you look at what's happening. I'm talking to you from Columbus, Ohio, but I grew up in Cincinnati. Springfield's right in between, and I used to spend a lot of time there growing up. It's a very different city today than it was back then right here in Ohio. We have seen an erosion of our national identity, but that means we need an immigration policy that prioritizes what that national identity is. And this is going to quickly get to a deeper philosophical question of what is American identity, but we can turn to that in a bit. Now, one set of immigration policies would say that we don't want competition for American workers, that if two immigrants are going to do a job for $10 an hour versus one domestic-born worker who's going to do it for $20 an hour, keep the two immigrants out and the domestic worker gets to do the job for $20 an hour. That's a protectionist worldview as it relates to labor. I don't think that that's a particularly great justification for an immigration policy to protect American workers from the effects of foreign price competition, because it's a losing battle you eventually lose through America's economic competitiveness with China and other countries anyway. But I do think it is legitimate to say that we want immigrants who are not only going to add economic value to the United States of America, but also immigrants who embody and really care about the ideals that the United States was founded on. To say that every immigrant who even enters this country has to pass the same civics test required for citizenship, bring that up for the green card. Make sure that they know English. I do think that English is, I don't know where you are on this, but I believe that English should be the national language of the United States, because we're a nation founded on ideals, but that can't exist if you can't even express or communicate those ideals or a common culture that you create around them. But that would be a different standard for immigration policy focused on the quality rather than quantity of immigration in either direction. But to say that we need the right kind of immigrants, not just in terms of economic contributions, that's important, but also in terms of civic commitments to the United States of America. I'm against dual citizenship for this reason, is you have immigrants who pledge their sole allegiance to the United States. So that will probably in the near term result in less immigration, but in principle, in the long run, it could go in a different direction. But that's what I think America First immigration policy looks like, is it's grounded in what American identity actually is, versus this notion that no, the goal of immigration policy is just, they used to be neoliberals saying it's just economic policy. Now it's just labor policy. I think neither of those is the right answer. Immigration is policy about our national identity and who we are as a nation. And I think that lurking underneath all of this, and I'll stop on this, diatribe you've got me started on right now after this, because I am very passionate about the subject, but lurking underneath all of this is that deeper question of what is American identity? And I think it's been said recently, and I think is provocative, and I think it's worth talking about that. America is not a creedal nation. That people will not die for a nation solely founded on abstract ideals. And I guess if that is your view, then that might inform your view of what immigration policy should look like. But my own view is actually, I do think that it's just a fact of history that the people who fought the American Revolution did fight for a nation founded on a set of ideals. And that geographic place that America is different than it was in 1776. I mean, those were 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard. America is just a very different geographic landscape. But what hasn't changed is the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that undergird our country. And so I think that is a deep philosophical divide, I think, brewing in the conservative movement that we, for very pragmatic reasons of managing the process to an election, have not allowed to see boil over. President Trump is excellent at really bridging this divide. And I think that he embodies elements of both of them. And I think in some ways that's what a movement leader needs at the right moments, is people who are able to bridge the right coalition to successfully get elected and govern. But I think at some point it's going to be unavoidable for us to really confront what philosophy of identity and then resultantly of economic policy, trade policy, immigration policy we adopt in the Republican Party. And that remains very much an open question. And I fall, on one side of that question.